Good afternoon. For those who have just joined us now, I'm Colonel Alberto Marinheiro, advisor at the National Defense Institute and coordinator of the conference Women, Peace and Security, 20 Years of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. I stress that for the success of this event, the discipline of microphones and cameras is essential. I strongly ask all participants, except the presenters and guest speakers, to keep cameras and microphones switched off during the entire event. If you want to intervene, please use the chat in a short and precise message to the moderator. For your information, this conference will be recorded. I wish you all an excellent and fruitful conference afternoon. To open the second panel of this conference, the transformative power of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, I give the floor to our keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Egnell, Vice-Chancellor of the Swedish Defense University. Professor Helena Carreiras is going to moderate this presentation. Thank you very much. Professor Robert Egnell, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Colonel. And let me just say how happy I am to be part of this day. And I really enjoyed the morning session. And will do my best to tackle the really difficult but interesting question of the transformative power of the 1325 agenda. I've been thinking hard about how I can do this in an interesting way, and I decided to use some slides. So I'm hoping the first slide in my presentation in front of you. Does it look okay?
Yes, we are seeing. We are seeing, Professor.
Wonderful.
Go on, please.
Thank you. Now, in order to look at the transformative potential of this agenda, we should obviously look back and take stock of the last 20 years, because that should give us an idea of the transformative power. But on the other hand, you have done a wonderful job of doing that already. What I would like to emphasize that you touched upon a bit this morning is that this has been a remarkable time, these last 20 years. We have seen tremendous progress that I thought the morning speakers highlighted really well. And at the same time, this has happened in an unprecedented modern era of strongmen and sort of a return to some authoritarian political ideologies that in many ways go hand in hand with rather misogynistic policies. So we are seeing a contradiction here that is really interesting, with the 1325 agenda being introduced with force within NATO, within the UN, and within the European Union. We are seeing feminist foreign policies, development policies developed in certain countries around the world, while on the other hand, we are seeing really authoritarian style leaders and traditional strongmen in many parts of the world. So these are difficult times, and I guess the jury is still out on where we are heading. The last thing I heard from the United States is that Biden just passed Trump in Pennsylvania as well, since we all seem to have a almost concerning passion for US elections here in Europe as well. This means, though, that we are seeing great potential. We have seen important changes already, but we're also seeing that the humanitarian space, and especially the space for women, is shrinking, and that we are seeing persecution of women's rights advocates all over the world. So there are really concerning developments as well that we need to keep an eye on. So during this keynote, I thought I would circle around a number of key points. First of all, I think to unlock the potential of the Resolution 1325, we have to stronger emphasize the transformative power of this agenda, and I'll come back to what I mean by that, because it goes hand in hand with other critical approaches to security. Somewhat contradictory to that, I think we also have to be more concrete. National action plans have been evolving and they're improving, but the implementation is, as I think it was Mara Marinaki who said, it's in the field. It's the implementation in the field, and that also means the field is at home in our countries, in each and every organization at the tactical level, and we have to be really good at transformational processes at home and in the field, and for that we need to be more concrete and much more context specific. Finally, a stronger emphasis on the existing power structures and security logics. And this means both the societal level and the power structures there, but as well as the individual level. And that means also including more discussions on what it means to be a man and what masculinity is. These are really difficult discussions to have because they obviously challenge the existing power systems and the existing identities of gender. To discuss this further, I would rather like to talk about a little bit the challenges we are facing in our time, to see what the transformative power might be. Now, traditionally, when we speak about security, we tend to speak about military security. And what we refer to are external military actors, and the subject of security is the state. So it's national security, the defense against external military forces. That's traditional hardcore security perspectives. And that has dominated the security debate and security policy for a very long time. At the same time, this is evolving constantly. Before 9/11, terrorism and terrorism scholars were some obscure people in police departments. No one would complain about including them in today's security analysis. Radicalization and fundamentalist violent groups. We are increasingly talking about cybersecurity, cyber defense, about information operations, fake news, and attempts to influence policy with means short of war. If we remove the antagonist part of our challenges, climate-based threats or related to natural disasters, they are upon us already, and they are likely to get worse over the next few decades. An enormous challenge for the entire world. Pandemics come and go, and this image is obviously not from the current corona pandemic, but rather it serves to also highlight, it's from the Ebola crisis a few years ago, because during that fall, everything was about the Ebola threat. And a few months later, we had forgotten about it, and it was all back to other issues. So it highlights how we forget, how quickly we move between different agendas, and how little we sometimes learn as well. Extreme poverty is an enormous challenge that the world is tackling. If we mix these all together, we are also facing a refugee crisis, trying to tackle that is either a consequence or mostly a consequence of all of these other challenges, from the military security problems to climate-based threats to extreme poverty. World statistics show that a third of all women have been subjected to violence in the home, which means that we are also looking at a private, traditionally defined security issue of enormous scale at the global level. You're going to have to bear with me. There's going to be a point at the end of all of this. If we start looking at statistics rather than emotionally evocative images, it's interesting to note how well battle-related deaths have been moving since the end of the Second World War. And it stops at 2015 here, and since then it's been going down a bit again. It peaked in Syria, and now we're back below 100,000 battle-related deaths globally every year. These are deaths by terrorist attacks in Western Europe, also declining if we look over the few decades, and not an enormous problem counted in deaths, but rather an enormous problem when we look at the emotional impact on our societies, obviously. Now, these are slightly old numbers, but it serves to highlight what we actually die from if it's not battle-related or terrorist attacks. The left column are developing countries, and you'll note that it's mostly about diseases, and many of them incredibly simple things to tackle. Diarrheal diseases, clean water, lower respiratory infections that kill millions. Well, all you need is a local health center and some penicillin, and you'll tackle those. We see malaria, childhood diseases, which vaccine and other things can tackle. Measles, for example. If we look at the right-hand column, there's also diseases, but slightly different ones, mostly heart and, well, cardiovascular diseases and cancer. But interestingly then, road traffic accidents and self-inflicted, meaning suicide. And if we look at, for example, violent death in the United States of America, more than 50% of the violent deaths are due to suicide. But we seldomly think about psychological health as a security issue. But clearly here, security is not about saving lives. In that case, we would have worked on these issues and we would have dealt with them a long time ago, and we would have directed resources. It's about something else in traditional terms. So some reflections. There's a wide-ranging set of issues that we really fear as a society and that really kills us, but that are not part of the traditional realm of security policy and practice. And there's no value in that, it's just a fact. The feeling of security and insecurity, they are subjective feelings. They are very seldomly related to an objective analysis or statistical figures. We tend to fear the wrong things in security policy, at least. Interesting, it seems, opinion polls about what individuals fear and what governments spend resources tackling. Now, you could say that that's a very lucky thing because individuals simply do not have the intellectual or intelligence resources to make those kind of grand priority decisions about what we should spend money on and what security threats we actually have that governments do. So there should be a disparity between the two. But you could also see it as an emerging democratic problem. This is an important one. The security of the state is by no means a guarantee for the security of individuals. I'd say in most countries it's rather the opposite. Namely, the state is by far the greatest security problem for the individuals in that state. And that means we have to stop equating state security with individual or societal security. The role of the state as a threat, as the victim or solution is changing. Threats that are borderless, that are sometimes not antagonistic, and that require global solutions. Not even the greatest power in the world can tackle the issues we are facing today, regardless of their resources. Another point I would like to make is that conventional divisions of labor between internal and external threats are increasingly irrelevant. Traditionally, the state has been construed so that certain agencies tackle internal issues, other agencies tackle external agencies or issues. And that division of labor is becoming increasingly problematic if we really want to understand and tackle today's problems. And I think the coronavirus is a perfect example of when the internal logic made us incredibly stupid in the handling of the virus. It made us nationalistic, and it made global priorities to tackle the spread of the virus much more difficult than it should have been. After that rather long intro, the point I'm trying to make here is that we need new concepts, we need new approaches, and perhaps also new organizations and instruments to tackle the challenges that we are facing today. And for me, the transformative potential of UN Security Council Resolution 3025 is one of those concepts and approaches. And when I say that, the resolution I'm talking about, it's also the fact that it's resting on the shoulders of the women's rights movement and of feminist theorists over a very, very long time. But the thing is something that is truly transformative. And that also is, for me, an important part of what I also work a lot on, and that is human security, a way of changing the focus from the state and the state's problems to the individual, and to start thinking about what are the security challenges for individuals. And then we can aggregate that on societal levels. But the focus is on the individual rather than the state. Also then stressing the fact that the state is a social construction that we have produced for ourselves for very good reasons in order to produce security for ourselves. But the state serves at our will, so to speak, through the social contract. So through a combination of gender perspectives and human security, I think there's really interesting ways of tackling old and new questions, especially the security problems we are facing today. But it's really the old questions of who is threatened and what needs to be secured. And again, we cannot take for granted that the state needs to be secured at all cost. We also need to think about from what is the actual threat here? It's not just external military problems we are facing today, but also things. But also then finally the instruments of security. By what means do we need to secure threats? Fascinating to read Pentagon's analysis on climate change, where they acknowledge it as a national security threat. At the same time, there's a slight scare in that, because if we militarize climate change, are we really producing the right kind of instruments to tackle it? During the Ebola crisis, military resources were considered essential once it was defined as a national security threat. But were those the most appropriate resources needed in Western Africa at that stage? There's a danger in producing logics that might not fit the problem if we tend to think in national security terms. Now, some of this may seem threatening or rather revolutionary, And again, we are talking about transformational processes. But one doesn't need to tear down the old order. One can also see these things as complementary to the traditional approaches. We don't have to stop thinking about national security, but we also need to think about human security, and we need to think about gender perspectives on security to tear down also problematic divisions between public and private problems, again, external and internal security challenges. So these can be mutually reinforcing and doesn't have to be as scary as it might sound. I'm also a rather pragmatic person working in a defense institution, and I would like everything not just to be intellectually interesting, but also have direct practical and operational impact. And I believe that these perspectives, they really do help us by creating better understandings of the problems we are facing, whether it's conflict analysis, a humanitarian disaster, grand geostrategic analysis, humanitarian or diplomatic negotiation, and what have you. I also think when you develop a better understanding of the situation, that will have an effect on the way you plan and execute operations. So there's a tremendous potential for transformation in how we do that through these perspectives. These things always highlight how important it is to be context specific. That's part of some of the mistakes we've done in the past, that we've tried to use blueprints from one conflict to another, leading to mistakes. Human security and gender perspectives, they do sort of drag us down to the ground and force us to become context specific in very high resolution detail. These perspectives also tend to focus on prevention and root causes of conflict, which is also helpful, because if there's something we have learned, it's the tremendously negative impact of violence and war, and costs in relation to preventive measures are enormous once you try to clean up the mess of a war. And that is also then a beneficial aspect. And importantly, it also emphasizes not just protection, but also empowerment, that we do not build security from top down, we build it from the bottom up as well. And that means empowering individuals to take care of themselves and their own situation. And I found it absolutely fascinating when I was doing research on the Eastern DRC and women's perspectives on security, and when they highlighted that regardless of our thoughts about the guerrilla groups, violence, the looting, the sexual violence, etc., they highlighted education for their children as their main security concerns. And really shows their understanding of empowerment as a security instrument. They know that without education, their children are doomed to the same situation they are in. And the only way out to a better life, to a better society, is if they are educated, which is a fascinatingly advanced analysis compared to what we often provide in our assessments on the ground. Now, I would like to focus on gender and the military. And what I often talk about is not just how this can be done, because that's part of what I've learned, because I have mostly worked with military organization and the implementation of gender perspectives there. But I've also worked with the justice sector and the court systems. I've also worked with solicitors and with the banking sector. And I found some really interesting similarities. These are obviously all traditionally strongly male environments that have been rather reluctant to feminist perspectives, to say the least. But I cannot just talk about how. I always have to talk about why we are doing these things as well, because I think that's one of the things we have to keep talking about if we want to continue unlocking the potential of this agenda. And the realization became incredibly clear to me when William Hague, the former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, came to Georgetown a number of years ago, and he said something absolutely wonderful in his speech. Something I thought, this is a statement I will always use in my lectures from now on, that there's no greater strategic prize of the 21st century than the full social, political, economic empowerment of all women everywhere. So the British Foreign Secretary said that this is the one most important issue this century. But obviously I'm one of those critical academics, so my mind started wandering. I asked myself, why is he saying that? Why isn't he saying that defeating terrorism, stopping climate change, peace on earth, or what have? There's a lot of strategic prizes that are really important this century. Why is the full social, political, and economic empowerment of all women everywhere the greatest strategic prize? So I raised my hand and I asked him that question, and he couldn't answer it. And that was so disappointing because the statement fell, in my view. It's such a good and such a strong statement, but you have to back it up with something. And that's what I've been spending a lot of time doing, trying to explain why he is absolutely right, that this is the one most important issue this century. And there's really two ways of looking at this, and we've had this debate so many times, obviously. It's the rights-based approach. More than half of the population is female. Women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. Women deserve the same economic, political, and social powers and resources as men do. And that's that. Gender equality is an end in itself worthy of fighting for. And therefore it is an incredibly important issue in its own right. There are challenges to that, though. Not everyone would agree that gender equality in its own right is more important than on earth. Ending poverty, defeating terror. Also, quite a lot of groups who would say, yes, gender equality is hugely important, but you have to understand we are in the business of war. So those types of politically correct issues, they have no place here. We have different standards that make us effective. So while we defend your right to be gender equal in society, it's not for us, thank you very much. And that to me means there are other arguments that are also required in order to convince people of the importance of this agenda. And those are the instrumental approaches, and where women's rights and gender equality, they are not just an end in themselves because it's the right thing to do. It's also a key that unlocks a potential to tackle all the other great strategic prizes of the 21st century. So if we want to defeat terrorism, end poverty, and create peace on earth and stop climate change, well, women's rights and gender equality is one of the really important instruments in order to do that. And if we don't improve women's rights, we are probably likely to fail in these other arenas as well. And that, to me, together with the rights-based arguments, is why this is such an important agenda and so highly important in its transformational power as well. Now, when you say that, though, you need strong evidence to back it up. Again, going back to William Hague's weakness in backing up what was really a strong and excellent statement. And we do know really strong research highlighting correlations between peace, happiness, and economic development and gender equality. So gender equal societies are happier, they are more peaceful internally and externally, and they are much richer than unequal societies. Now, that doesn't mean gender equality leads to richness and happiness, but rather that there is a very strong correlation. But we're also seeing increasing research that do follow the causal change that also strongly indicate a causal relationship, and that it's not peace, happiness, and economic development that leads to gender equality, but rather vice versa. And that's important. We need more research on that to really back it up. At the more micro level, it's what I usually refer to as operational effectiveness. And we're seeing this in all kinds of arenas. Obviously, I've studied military affairs to a very large extent, and I'll come back to that. But most of the research is in business and finance, where gender equal company boards and production teams make more money, are more productive, etc. Staff is healthier. Recruitment and retention of staff is easier, etc. when you have inclusive, gender equal, or in other terms, multifaceted organizations. Within the development sector and the humanitarian sectors, there's also really interesting research highlighting the increased effectiveness of these types of work and operations when you apply a gender perspective and a gendered approach to international aid and humanitarian assessment and operations, but also in crisis management, consular work, and societal resilience. So there's really interesting evidence out there, and I'm sorry to say I don't have time to sort of go through them area by area, but I will rather focus on the military level very shortly. The interesting question, though, is if these research findings are correct, that there's something to gendered approaches about gender equality, women's inclusion that leads to not just women's rights and gender equality, but also improved operational effectiveness in other areas, then what is it? What is it that happens in an organization that makes it more effective when it's gender equal or when it's more inclusive? And one could then say, well, one explanation would be women are obviously better, so the more women you include in an organization, the better it will become. But usually we are not so stretched for competence that we don't have the luxury of picking and choosing rather good people. Now, if for example, we would put together an armed force that includes 100% of the population, including all the women, 50% of the population would obviously make it more effective in terms of fighting force. But usually we are looking for lean and mean these days, which means we rather need to pick out the really, really good ones. And you could obviously say that, well, if we look for people within the entire bulk of the population, we will, as in a sum, be more effective. And that's great. But it surely isn't the entire explanation. Rather, what seems really interesting from research, especially in other areas, especially business, is that everyone seems to perform better. Men also perform better in gender equal environments. And it's not just a matter of production and making money. It's also the happiness of the workers, the health of the workers, the number of prescription pills they take, for example, which is an interesting measure they always have in US studies on happiness. So it seems the explanation is not really at the individual level, but rather at the unit level to a larger extent. What happens within the group when it's inclusive and gender equal? Why does the group or the society perform better when it's inclusive and gender equal? And then we arrive at that difficult question: what is it that women bring to the table, to the negotiating table? What competences do they bring to the military that makes it more effective? And I really agree with Claire Hutchinson that this is a really slippery slope to ask those types of questions. It essentializes gender competences, if you will. It places different traits within men and women, and we really shouldn't go there. Sometimes being a woman is necessary in military operations, for example. If you do security operations in environments like Afghanistan, you can't body search or you can't search the female parts of housing unless you are a woman. And that means you might miss important aspects. It might be easier sometimes to talk to the female part of the population, which means better intelligence gathering if you have women. But that's not really because of certain competences in those women. It is because of their sex, being a woman. We can always talk about the competences necessary, for example, to win war. But I think we do not have to gender specify these competences, but rather look at what do we need in order to be an effective fighting force or peacekeeping force. But something happens within units, within organizations, when you mix people from different backgrounds, and that seems to be a positive effect. For a long time in the military, the assumption was the opposite, that homogeneous groups, preferably male from the same geographical area and really same cultural and class background, that is a good thing in a military unit. Its unit cohesion is easy to construct, and it'll be a strong fighting force. They'll know each other, they will understand each other, and therefore be very effective. And it seems from the little research we have on heterogeneous units rather than homogeneous units, that those traditional assumptions are flawed. And Anthony King in the UK has done interesting research on this, highlighting that unit cohesion in professional armed forces isn't about social cohesion, it's about professional cohesion. For example, he highlights that it's the perception of competence in your teammates that leads to cohesion, not whether you know them socially or you can relate to them. And this is quite interesting. Another thing is when you're trying to solve complex problems, you need diversity. You need different perspective, and that's why diverse, inclusive environments tend to perform better in intellectual tasks. But what is interesting is that simple construction teams in car factories also seem to perform better when they are diverse. If we zoom in on war and military affairs, we are dealing with very specific organizations that have formed over, if not millennia, then centuries. They have been built, trained, and equipped for war as its core task. And obviously, the organization considers itself rather excellently fine-tuned for that task. So when you start questioning the identity, the training, or the structure of the armed forces, well, you're challenging centuries of experience and culture for that specific task. And that requires a level of respect and humility when you approach organizations like that. These are also very large and complex organizations, incredible bureaucracies that are not easily changed. They also have strong cultural, professional identities that do not tend to take in gender perspectives very easily, although that is somewhat changing. And also, it's an organization that tends to be on the defensive when it comes to these issues. Most often when military organizations are faced with these questions, it's because of allegations of sexual assault, of misbehavior in the field, and of gender bias, for example, in recruitment. And that means it's usually a negative thing to talk about gender perspective rather than a positive thing, speaking about let's include a gender perspective to become an even better fighting force or a better organization that can recruit better people. There are strong arguments against the inclusion of women and gender perspectives in the military as well. And someone as respected as Martin van Creveld has said that women in the military is part symptom, part cause of the decline of the advanced military, which is obviously an incredibly misogynistic comment, but it also highlights a very traditional view of women in the military, and thereby an incredibly high hurdle that sometimes has to be climbed. The statement is often based on the functional demands of warfare, that this is such a specific physical and psychologically demanding task that women simply have no place. You need muscular and mental strength that the allegation is women do not have. Now, there are really easy ways to get over that problem, and that is to have standards for every soldier or officer position, and whoever passes those standards are welcome. And there are enormous amounts of women who would pass that standard. So it's a poor excuse to exclude women also from combat roles. But otherwise, it's also comments about unit cohesion, for example. Again, I've addressed that. But this just highlights why there is quite a lot of resistance. And obviously, the organization is right to ask questions about this, because the purpose of the armed forces isn't to be a gender equal organization, it's to be an effective organization in defending the nation and its people and to create international security. And if we do things to the organization that lowers its effectiveness in its core task, well, that's a real problem. So we should ask the question, is this detrimental to the organization and its effectiveness? But we should do it with an open mind. And so far, the research would rather indicate the opposite, that is some very beneficial forces, as it is to most organizations in other fields, to include both a more inclusive organization with more women and other backgrounds, but also gender perspectives on operations, gender as a capability, as the previous panel discussed. These are just examples again of how these perspectives can improve military operations. But I would like to, the last few minutes, talk about the how question. Because unlocking the transformational potential means thinking very hard about how do you introduce, how do you integrate these perspectives in, for example, reluctant organizations like the military. And we've studied this in the international cooperation, and this is one of the books that's been an outcome. I started out by looking at the Swedish military and then an international comparison. And I've touched upon many of the things already. The starting point is hugely important. One needs to start from within the framework of the organization's core task. To speak to military organizations, you have to talk about gender perspectives and the in the core task of the organization. And if you speak to the banking sector, well, it's about making money for shareholders, then that's the approach you have to take to gender equality. It's a very, very instrumental approach at that level. Otherwise, you quickly lose their attention. You need respect, therefore, for the functional imperative of the organization. If warfighting is the task of the organization, then respect it and understand why it has developed the culture it has. No one has done it to be disrespectful of the other gender, but it's rather because they think it is the appropriate thing to do to be as effective as possible. we have to move away from this as a zero-sum game. That's a real danger, that either we become gender sensitive or we maintain an effective fighting force. We have to work hand in hand. Through the inclusion of women and gender perspective, we will be an even better organization, an even better fighting force. There's a number of different strategic choices one can make when looking at this as well. Do we change from the top or from the bottom, for example? And my research shows that the traditional double grip on the middle part of the organization that is required. You need the grassroots, but you also need strong strategic leadership from the top. I also think within bureaucracies this large, you cannot change it from the outside, only through legislation or through activism. But you also have to work with the organization you're seeking to change, not against it, so to speak. You have to work with it and within it. Is this about adding women, or is it about creating gender awareness? Some would argue add women and stir, and things will happen. So our international comparison, we hope to answer this by looking at countries that have been good at including women in the armed forces. What we're seeing there is very little impact on its gender awareness of gender perspective within the armed forces of those nations. We also have examples of countries like Sweden that have done a wonderful job of creating gender awareness within the organization, trying to change the culture. And it has had a rather limited impact on recruitment of women. So the jury is still out, but we are not seeing very clear causal links between the one or the other, which means rather than say that okay, add women and stir or focus on gender awareness, we have to think about this as a double grip again. Let's do both in the hope that one leads to the other, or that we don't miss anything at least. Right, I think I would like to stop here actually to allow time for questions as well. I've touched upon a lot of things and there's so much more I would like to talk about, but let's move to questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Robert. This was really a wonderful presentation. So many questions. And yeah, we have some limited time, but anyway, we have already a few questions that have been put forward in the chat. And one of them, I will start with this one, is about why do you think we talk about effects of gender integration on effectiveness with regard to women's presence, but we don't question effectiveness with regard to men or to what's there. Are our forces effective? Why don't we question this? I know this is one good argument that you have put forward, so I would like to give you the opportunity also to share with us your opinion, because what you've done really is really great, since you brought us back to concepts, and it's not only about having heterodox and orthodox perspectives. You took us back to the doxa, to the conditions that make this dialogue possible, and also question our concepts, such as, for instance, looking at human security and what it means in terms of our discussions. And there is a second question exactly on this. What is the role for the use of armed forces by the international community, if your perspective is a human security perspective? Okay, so there's a second question. And yeah, let me see. Maybe another one regarding the role of evidence. You gave us a lot of evidence, or mention the studies, the research that has been done and that can be used to answer the difficult questions, and which is needed because there must be good arguments to explain why gender is important, why things change when you have a diversity climate, etc. However, we have also been witnessing the fact that facts are not always considered or important to change minds. Unfortunately, we that work on social sciences, so besides what you already have indicated, what do you think could be done to, from within the institutions, to really convince people that these results are real and that this could help improve the quality of our institutions and the missions that they are performing? Thank you. I think that
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Those are all excellent questions. First one, why to convince the positive, but and that is the simple answer is yes. Against the role of women in the armed forces, especially it doesn't in the investment banking sector or in other sectors where you have to make the same sort of convincing arguments that so it's just about bias, really. We shouldn't have to explain why it's important to have women as part of our armed forces. But that's the case all the time, and when we have to when we speak about gender perspective or gender as an instrument that helps us be a more effective force, again, we have to provide evidence and explain why that is important. But no one questions why we do social patrols or why we do other things that we do daily within military operations and whether it really has an impact on effectiveness. So it's incredibly unfair, but unfortunately it's just a fact that we will have to live with until that bias is gone and the argument is won, so to speak. But you're absolutely right in pointing out the absurdity in trying and having to explain why it's useful to have women in any organization. The second question is a more fundamental one about the use of armed forces or I guess violence in the promotion of human security. And again, if we lived in a great pacifistic world, we would need armed forces, but we don't. And that means to me that human security approaches and other instruments of security, they are complementary to armed forces. We also know that one of the greatest threats to human security is war. When large-scale warfare breaks out, it's the other niceties like disease become smaller problems because the society is burning, so to speak. Thus, armed forces also play an important role in providing human security. It's just that we have to remember that it's not the only instrument of security. We need to add the other instruments that provide job security, health, and education, and what have you, that promotes security in a broader sense, and that avoids radicalization and populism and what have you. So I would rather stress it as a complement, but that also means that armed forces will have to understand their role within a larger security perspective, because my problem is that the military automatically considers itself by nature the most important actor of security, or if you have to prioritize resources, then they should go to the military, and it might be so in certain security situations, but it's not necessarily so. And we obviously see security or defense budgets that differ from zero in Iceland to more than 50% in North Korea. So there's different ways for governments to approach defense funding. and NATO wants 2% of GDP funding of defense, and maybe that's the appropriate amount to provide a decently strong armed force. Maybe it's too much for certain societies that have other problems that are or that provide more pressing needs. That's for each electorate and country to decide for themselves in some ways. The final question was about evidence, and the fact that if we were and it relates also to the security problem. You know, it's not about evidence, it's not about data, it's about feelings and emotions. And it's the same thing about these issues. I can present data day in and day out, and certain people wouldn't be convinced anyway, because it's not just about the rationality and the evidence of it. And that means, well, I think a lot of people are attracted by strong evidence, so we shouldn't stop working to provide it. But we also have to find other ways. This is about power, it's about politics, and politics, as we have learned lately, is very much about other things than facts. And that means we also need to be able to play that power and political game. We have to find the rhetoric, the evocative arguments that might convince. And I'm horrified to see that quite often I can say the exact same things that feminists have been saying for decades. And just because I'm a man from the defense sector, people find it incredibly convincing and interesting. And I refuse to think that I'm such a brilliant speaker that is the whole difference between me and other people. But it's rather, who am I? What do I represent? And that also shows, again, there are other issues at play than facts and rationality. And unfortunately, we have to be able to do that as well. And that, for me, means, even though I find it incredibly disturbing to have that unproportionate level of influence as a male advocate of gender equality, I rather than step back, I use that power for something good. But it's something one needs to be aware of, these challenges, and that also means we need to find those arguments that work, and not just the arguments that are right. From a rights-based approach, I say we shouldn't use fake news. I'm really not advocating that. But sometimes it's the more emotional arguments that do seem to work. And especially, I found it really interesting in the banking sector that if I just learn to use their language and way of behaving, and I wear a suit and a tie, I look like them, they feel comfortable suddenly. And that means so much in the convincing argument that I'm making, rather than what I am actually saying. So there are other things, but first of all, do find the evidence, back it up, and win the argument. But there are also other things. So thank you very much for your time and for excellent questions. I look forward to the panel as well.
Thank you so much, Robert. We are, in fact, reaching the time for the next panel. I would really like to thank you for your insightful comments, your presentation. I think this will be so useful for all of us to reflect on strategy, how to proceed and develop our policies and actions to take into account our power, our differential powers to contribute to the transformation we would like to see in reality. So thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you. And I will now pass the floor to Colonel Marinheiro, who is introducing the next panel. Thank you.
you, Dr. Robert Agnell. Thank you, Professor Helena Carreira. So I think we have all in place to begin the second roundtable. With that will now take place with the moderation of Lieutenant Colonel Diana Moraes, Head of the Ministry of Defense Office for Equality, to whom I pass the floor.
Thank you very much, Colonel Marinheiro. Good afternoon. I welcome you to our second panel. We've just had a great introduction to the topic provided by our... And we now have an amazing lineup of speakers. It is a pleasure to me to be sharing this roundtable. Before I start, just a quick reminder. It's never too much to remind you that during the presentations, we urge all participants to use the chat function to submit your questions. Now, let me start with some recent statements on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. From the UN Secretary General, the continued marginalization of women from decision-making and peace processes damages everyone. The EU High Representative Vice President said, "Today, we don't need more resolutions. What we need is implementation on the ground." And last, the NATO Secretary General highlighted the fact that when we talk about security issues, from military attacks to hybrid attacks or even pandemics, we need to recognize who they affect and how. This is vital to shape solutions that will serve everyone. So my question is simple. 20 years have passed since the adoption of the groundbreaking Resolution 1325. We have now a strong normative foundation, and our leadership recognizes that there is no sustainable peace without women and without the inclusion of the gender dimension in everything we do. So why do all of us engaging with the Women, Peace and Security agenda still have to justify and demonstrate it is essential, not an add-on, and it is right and the smart thing to do? I agree we must continue to explain the why, as our keynote speaker mentioned before, but we also need to move beyond it. What is the way forward to reach the transformative change embedded in the Women, Peace and Security agenda? I leave you with these provocative questions, and without further delay, I will now present our first speaker, Charlotte Isaacson. Charlotte is a senior gender expert to European External Action Service, principal advisor on gender. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you very much, all. Boa tarde e muito obrigado pelo convite para esta importante conferência. And this was my attempt to say something thankful and nice in Portuguese. And possibly some of you appreciated that effort, that I actually tried to say something in the language of the organizers to show my gratitude and my thankfulness. And this is really what I want to express to you all, that this is a great opportunity. But if we take what I just did and we refer it to 1325, so think if I in 20 years would speak the same quite poorly and not that well prepared slogan to you, perhaps you wouldn't be that impressed any longer, and not either about the effort, because as time goes on, we also have the full right to expect much more. And this is how I think we should see UN Security Council 1325, with all the achievements, and we heard about many of them today. But still there is a debate whether the glass is half full or half empty, but I think we all can agree that it is half. It is not a full glass. So my thesis and my hypothesis is really that we are far from where we want to be. There are many reasons which we have perhaps different views upon why that is the case, and I will share with you a few of them from my end, because this, as you understand very well, is something I have been thinking quite extensively about since having worked with this topic for now 20 years. And I I argue that the answers to the challenges and questions are to be found within the community of practice or the social field of people working with this topic, may it be as a researcher or a practitioner or military or police or a diplomat or a politician or whatever. But the answer is within that group, and it's not primarily because opposition elsewhere, for example, from certain nations that might not be as enthusiastic about this topic as, for example, I am myself. This is very clear to me, perhaps not to everyone, and it's probably a good foundation for a discussion, but this is how I came to see the reality in which we operate since quite many years now. So I want to start to present a few things to you from the perspective I see it, from the work I do and have been doing now for many years. After that, I will share with you some achievements, which certainly deserves to be mentioned. And then I will share with you the way I think about transformation or non-transformation. So I think the battle is not only about whether it is transformative or transformative/responsive or not. I think it is whether it is responsive/transformative versus symbolic. And this is something we didn't yet in this community of practice or in the debate speak much about. But let me share with you, and I think this is in particular interesting today, being with a very security heavy audience, which is very much my own backyard and my own, where I have my primary experience, so I feel very much at home. But I find that there are some things that does not add up. So I claim that a society where violence against women or gender equality, as Robert just said, is more gender equal, is less prone to engage in conflict or armed conflict. And if that is, as Valerie Hudson says, the best predictor, another predictor is male polygamy. Another thing I claim is that if we have too many men in the same sort of space without meaningful engagement, especially young men, that's really, really a bad recipe for security and stability. And the fourth thing I claim is that women's security is a better indicator for peace and stability than is women's inclusion. Okay, so what did she say now? Yeah, she said apparently things that are not really part of the discussion or the dominating narratives around women, peace and security, because these things I just said is, in my view, not much spoken about, not much discussed. I don't read so much about this. There is, but not much. I argue that one thing we can see now after 20 years is that security/protection professionals are almost completely absent from the discussion and the implementation of the women, peace and security agenda. And I'm not speaking about people working in security sector, like in military or especially women working in certain areas. It could be both combat or human resource, doesn't matter. But I mean the people working primarily as the main occupation with security and protection. In my view, they are completely absent. And to me, that is incredibly interesting, because when this resolution came to the Security Council in 2000, it was a securitizing act, a deliberate securitizing act by some actors who advocated for getting these topics into the table of the Security Council. But in my view, the securitization act really became only a securitization attempt, and it stopped there. And so far, women have not, to almost any extent, benefited from enhanced or increased security or protection both sort of, physical security, but also security of their human rights and to safeguard their human rights. So I just wanted to put this out there as a food for thought, and also as an attempt from my end to introduce me a little bit more to you, so you know where I come from. So this anniversary is a great opportunity to take stock where we are, where we're going. In this seminar I participated in last week, the question we got from the moderator was, in your view, is it likely that 1325 of Women, Peace and Security will actually lead to transformation? And my response to that then, and also this week, so it hasn't changed in 1 week, is that no, I don't think so. Not if we do the things we do as we do them now, both in terms of what and how. So that might come across as, a disappointing message. However, with that, I also think that even in such a context, many things can be done, many things can be achieved. And as was said this morning, there is a wealth of achievements, not at least on the normative, putting it on the agenda and the training point of view. But all of these three, the normative or also the bureaucratic, I think Helena presented a term like that, creating structures and positions, etc., plans and policy. On the training side, there is a wealth of trainings and training centers and training courses, and there is gender mainstreamed courses, and it's quite a big industry, I would say. And also but even if those things are achievements, it's also not only necessarily a great thing, even if it is a great thing. So we need to be able to keep two thoughts in the head at the same time, in my view, because this, imagination or perception of having a great success or progress in terms of documents or a position here or an action plan there or a seminar and a conference, etc., it can actually lead to that we take the eyes off the ball. It can give the impression that we are achieving much more than we are actually doing. And what do I mean with this? Yeah, I mean that, who is benefiting from those achievements? Who is the beneficiary? Is it men, women, girls, and boys in conflict and post-conflict situations, or is it people like, for example, me, who have a great job in the European Union and I can have decent food to serve my kids, and I can also give them Christmas gifts every year? So I think these questions also, when working on this topic within the community of practice, are incredibly important to ask yourself and preferably discuss together with colleagues, because in my view, there are some also quite uncomfortable questions that needs to be discussed and needs to be put on the table. And why am I saying this? Yeah, because when I have been now engaged the last weeks in many seminars and webinars, again, there is something that doesn't add up. So there is two parallel stories, like almost two parallel universes at the same time. So there is this nice story projecting great progress and achievements and things that have been done. And having been around for quite a while now and being an old woman, I'm struck by the fact that I hear very few to almost none new things. And I was in a seminar last week where things were projected as great progress, but actually we did it 8 years ago. So what I mean is that we really have to be very careful, and we also have to be very honest with yourself, of course, but also honest with each other, because we are in this together, in my view. So we have some homework to do also in the community of practice, in the social field of women, peace and security, and it's not that simple so that we can point at certain countries like China or Russia and say, if it wouldn't just be for them, we would be good off, because that's not the case. Also, if training would be this magic stick, we would be done by now almost, because we have been training a lot of colleagues over the years, and still we are struggling, and we see that things are not adding up. So we see that there is quite much training of gender advisors, for example. So I don't know the figures, but I know by now quite many people have gone to training for gender advisors, but that doesn't correlate even closely to how many people are actually doing a job that is that job or a job similar to that, in my view. So I do think we really need to have some, inward looking on what we are doing and also how we are doing things. So that said, in the European Union, you heard this morning from my boss, we have been taking steps forward. We are very proud of them. We have been actually focusing on quite boring things, not things that you can put on the website, or, it would never survive into a glossy brochure in any form, because it's quite boring, administrative, bureaucratic work taking place in, boring meetings or, in front of your computer. But I also think that it is really important to get away from this approach where we always and constantly have the balloons and parades and the drums, because that is something you can do when you start with something new. But really, it's not sustainable to continue with that after 10, 20, or 30 years, because then you have to go into another phase of development, which is in an institution as in which I am working now. It is almost like any other job, to be honest. So we have been doing a lot of things, but we also have identified that we also have some quite still remaining big obstacles internally. So, and those obstacles, we decided that we have to put them on the table, because if we don't speak about them and if we do not address them, they will continue to stop and prevent every success we wish to have on all those external things we want to achieve. And this is why in our Women, Peace and Security Policy Framework, we said that a precondition for at all being successful to implement the EU policy framework on women, peace and security is that these conditions are in place. And the first, which we presented, and I'm very happy to say that this is now, as will the Women, Peace and Security Framework, be integrated in the new Gender Action Plan, which will be adopted here soon. So the bigger gender equality, women's empowerment framework, Women, Peace and Security will be a part of that. And also in that, we establish leading by example and gender responsive leadership as a requirement. And what we mean with gender responsive leadership is that the leader and manager need to lead by example, both in the workplace and when directing the implementation of the mandate. Secondly, it is about mainstreaming of a gender perspective in a systematic way based on gender analysis. Third, it is about motivating and enabling staff to deliver on gender equality commitments. Next is that you have to consult and strategically involve gender advisors, gender focal points, and other gender equality experts. And finally, a gender responsive leader holds staff to account for implementing gender equality commitments. And for us, we realize that this must be in place, because otherwise people like me, gender advisors, gender focal points, we can do whatever, magic tricks we would like. But if we don't have the leadership who is gender responsive at the least, and let me be very clear, I'm speaking not about a gender champion, because that's something else. A gender responsive leadership is a requirement for all, and you have to do it 7 days a week, every day of the year. And it's not a choice, and it has to be in the job descriptions, etc. And you have to be held accountable. We have to make sure that this is the new normal. And if we have this in place, of course, much more will be easier. Another obstacle we realize, which is also a precondition to success, is of course gender mainstreaming. We have just done an enormously huge evaluation of the Gender Action Plan 1 and the Gender Action Plan 2, and on top of that, some other gender work EU have been doing in the last decade. And together with gender responsive leadership, or the lack of gender leadership, it was also very clear that the absence of gender mainstreaming, and even absence of the understanding of what gender mainstreaming is really a preventing factor. So this means that we have to focus on these things. And of course, again, this is not something that is very interesting for an external audience to hear about. You know, it sounds very boring, probably, and it might be, but we strongly see and think and feel that this is really what will make a difference. Because again, if we don't have these things in place, everything else will happen. So we are happy with that, and we are very optimistic. So with that, I just wanted to say finally something about coming back to transformation and yeah, how I see about this, because I have been working now for some years as a gender advisor or a gender person in different organizations, in different types of headquarters, under different national leadership. And mentioning national leadership, I want to really thank Portugal for being such a strong leader on this topic, not at least in the Central African Republic, where it was really a best practice to see that the commander actually brought his own gender advisor from home, and also, of course, General Mayo in MPCC is really a gender responsive leader. So spread that message around, and everyone who knows me know that I would never say this if that would not be the case. So what I wanted to say about transformation is that I do think it is difficult to transform if there is not a shared vision or a shared objective. And in my view, and speaking with the people I meet in my work since many, many years now, I do understand that there are many different views. And of course, that's not necessarily a problem. You know, of course, everyone have the right to share your own view and have your own opinion, and also coming from different backgrounds, etc. So that's normal. But if you want to transform something, if you want really to change something, it is an enabling factor if you share the same objective and the same vision, because that's against what you have to measure your achievements, and that's against what you will work, and you will have to set up a strategy and a plan. And with Women, Peace and Security, we in the European Union, we say that the objectives are 3. So they are gender equality, peace and security. But I meet people quite often saying that, no, that's not correct. The only objective with Women, Peace and Security is peace. Yeah, okay, so of course, again, we have different views on that. But if you want a unison transformation, if it is scattered and fragmented, both in where to go, how to do it, and who should do it, etc. Of course, if you look at everything and anything we know about theory of change and change management, etc., of course, it is, to say the least, quite difficult to achieve sustainable transformation in such a fragmented context. So I think that is really a big challenge, which I do not have the answer to. I also think that this touches upon the face that there are many claiming ownership, or, you know, knowing better or knowing best, etc. And of course, if you represent an organization, you can always put forward what that organization agreed. But there is some unhealthy competition in this fragmented field of players, which is not either very helpful in terms of actually achieving sustainable results and transformation. So again, in my view, there are some really important discussions that needs to be had, and hopefully we can tick that box in 10 years But as it looks now, I would say that the glass is more on transformation. The glass, in my view, is more half empty than half full. That's my honest view. So with that, I stop. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to listen to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you for your honesty and your bold approach. I think it was a really good starting point for our discussion later on. And I will now pass to our second speaker, which is Louise Olsen, and she's a senior researcher at Peace Research Institute Oslo. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I really wish we could have all met in Portugal, and eventually I hope that we will. I will try to share a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can get it to work. So my name is Louise Olsen. I'm a senior researcher, as we said, at the Peace Research Institute, focusing very much on how armed conflict affects men and women and their different roles and influences and security, also in post-war reconstruction. Prior to this, I was the Women, Peace and Security Senior Advisor at the Folke Bernadotte Academy, which is a government agency under the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I also worked with the transition of knowledge into practice, focusing also there very much on the use of sex disaggregated data and sort of systematic studies, which I think is something that we now see is coming very much. So in a few weeks, the FBA, together with PRIO and UN Women, will actually launch a series of brief with some new data and research that we think will also contribute to the continued discussions in the new decade. Like Charlotte, I really also thought that the title for this session was really thought-provoking, the transformative power of women, peace and security, and what this has meant in these 20 years. And I think I'm slightly bit more optimistic than Charlotte, although I completely agree. I think we're probably not at the half level of the glass definitely yet. And I think that's because it's really important to remember at the really low starting point for which we really came. So let me illustrate that with a personal example. So in 1998, I was finishing my studies at Uppsala University at Peace and Conflict Research. And I was looking for a theme to write my final paper on. And it actually struck me as I was thinking, there was a bit of a puzzle that I hadn't heard women mention more than once during my entire study. So that was as absent as women was from the discussions on peace and security related matters at all. And that was not just in Uppsala, it was a global phenomenon. Apart from the areas where really strong women, particularly from conflict areas, were fighting to get their rights and situation recognized. So the only thing that the ones I did hear, however, was a peacekeeper who came to visit the department during a class, and he told us about his experiences in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and about giving an example of how the population had been affected by the war by exampling with women who'd been shot by snipers in Sarajevo. And that image and that thought really remained with me. So why were these women being killed? They were definitely not soldiers. And what role do women then actually play in armed conflict? So I wrote my final paper on sort of under what conditions women are recruited as combatants into rebel groups. By now, we know that 30% of all rebel groups actually use female combatants and female soldiers in particularly certain areas globally. So it's not an uncommon phenomenon, but it was really not much discussed at this time. And there was also not very much easily accessible information or sex disaggregated data. So the quality of my thesis was really following suit to that condition. But what really did capture my attention was the fact that disaggregating information about war into what women and men did and how they were affected gave me a much better understanding of disinformation campaigns, recruitment campaigns, access to resources, the effects on the whole of society, where women and men really played very different roles. So it got me a very much more nuanced understanding of armed conflict, and also how the different ways to try to address that conflict also played on those dynamics and also affected men and women in very different ways. And I think that today, that form of sort of transforming our knowledge of war, if we are fair, Charlotte, and compare sort of news coverage and sort of discussions about war today, they are more nuanced. We are starting to see, or to at least recognize, that armed conflict isn't just about, you know, men doing male business and women sort of being on the sidelines, which was very much some of the thinking back 20 years ago. We are starting to see how different actors act and what the different situations are for men and women in a more nuanced way. But we still have a very long way to go to take that knowledge and turn it into concept that we can then use sort of in a systematic operational way to actually reach implementation. What has also happened in these last 20 years is by now the research, particularly systematic research, is really starting to grow and can sort of also really much speak to and help sort of that conceptual understanding and also the how to reach implementation, as also Robert described earlier. And where these two meet is actually in relation to some of the key arguments used to explain why WPS is important and also what the problems are that should be addressed. And some of this research is also starting to question some of the arguments that we are using today and say that if we are going to work towards evidence-based decisions, if we are going to really use effective tools to target these problems at their core, there are other things that we might need to add or to nuance. And I think, for example, if you look at NATO's work, that has very much come into practice. They are also really taking on new arguments and nuancing the different existing arguments. So what I would like to propose here is just to bring up a few of those arguments to contribute to see where new research is taking us and what it says about how we think around many things around women, peace and security. So the first argument is a very classical one, and I should say before we start that research does in no way question why these arguments are being used. They agree that the problems are really serious, but it's more a question of discussion and nuance rather than questioning. Okay, so what I would like to do now that I turn the page is that you all think, do you think that the argument, the statement that I'm presenting, if it's backed up by evidence or not? Has it passed an empirical test? Women and children are most affected by armed conflict. Do you think that this is an evidence-based statement? Well, research said in some few conflicts that can be the case, but most often it is not. Women and children are not most affected, particularly not by war violence. But just like Charlotte said earlier, it's important to think and recognize that war negatively affects men, women, boys and girls, but in slightly different ways. And when I ask my students what they think about this argument, the first thing they normally ask me before they respond, because they're very clever, they say, what do you mean by affected? So what do we then mean by affected? Well, according to research, men tend to get killed to a much higher extent than women because they are still the majority of the soldiers. So, for example, if we return to the example from Bosnia-Herzegovina, so during the siege of Sarajevo, some studies say that about those killed in battle, 83% were men and 17% were women. However, research said this does not mean that we in any way should assume that all men are actors and all women are victims. If you actually look at who uses violence, the absolute majority of men, even in war zones, do never use violence. So we should not work with the stereotypical assumption of men being violent. And also, in most conflict zones, women tend to have more active roles in the fighting than we tend to assume. So it's a much more complex role than we have tended to assume. In addition, we need to broaden our understanding, just like Robert also discussed earlier, of the impact of war on society. So again, if you use the same study as an example, of those civilians killed in Sarajevo, 54% were male and 46% were women. If you also add the consequences of war on society as a whole, so the food and water security, then of course the problem becomes even more complex. So understanding effects of war means that recognizing that all groups are affected and just in different kinds of ways. And also that the constructions, and perhaps this is the key takeaway, of males as protectors and women in need of protection is not a particularly effective way of thinking about vulnerabilities at war. So we should try to move away from those kinds of stereotypical understandings. And in this, if we then recognize that political violence also target women, how should we then understand this form of violence? And what kind of violence that we primarily think target women? So this is statement number 2. Conflict-related sexual violence is the most reported form of political violence targeting women. So do you think that this is backed up by empirical research? Well, not according to research. It is a very, very serious form of violence, but we need a much more nuanced understanding of how violence targets women in order to understand women's agency and also how to understand protection. So this is a new data set by Ackland released last year that has really tried to capture the different kinds of violence that are targeting women, and they use the word target specifically because often we talk about violence against women like there is no agency behind it, that it just happens. But of course, this is very targeted political actions with a purpose. And what we can see is actually that attacks and abductions and also mob violence tend to be the most common forms of violence in this. Another thought-provoking recent research results along the same line come from Zoe Marks and Erica Chenoweth that shows that women's participation in campaigns, both non-violent campaigns and armed campaigns, makes these campaigns much more likely to succeed because, as they argue, they tend to add numbers, legitimacy, and also tactical innovation in terms of the different approaches used. However, those kinds of campaigns, also the non-violent campaigns, actually tend to meet much more violence. So it's something about these mixed mass mobilizations, including both women and men, that are apparently seen as much more threatening to those in power than also the male-dominated campaigns. So this underlines that what we are talking about here and what we're trying to understand is that women are agents and they are part of political changes. This is not sort of making women agents. It is about how women today act and how we understand their agency and the consequences and dynamics around armed conflict. So even if it's not the most commonly reported form of violence, of course, sexual violence is a very, very serious form of violence and it's present in all regions around the world. So what is important here, I think research would like to add, is that the work against impunity and also for gender equality are very important. However, peacekeepers serve a very important role in directly targeting the groups that are responsible for this form of violence. It's probably the most effective way to directly try to prevent further abuse. And this actually requires exactly the same kind of knowledge that a military organizations use in general, because much of that sexual violence is actually the cause of poorly functional military organizations. So they need help in terms of upholding chains of command, leadership, and also control of their troops. So it is very much a question of also developing that capacity. There was a forum in international peacekeeping just released on this, where you can read more if you are also interested. And on the theme of peacekeepers, let us move to the next statement. An increased number of female peacekeepers limit the risk of sexual exploitation and abuse of the host population by peacekeeping personnel. Do you think that this is backed up by empirical research? Well, this argument has sort of had a bit of a twofold use. One is, of course, to handle the very serious problem of sexual exploitation and abuse, and the other has been like an effectiveness-formed argument to also try to promote the use of female or deployment of female personnel. And research really warns against that kind of argument. It really adds often a burden to women personnel who are often in a minority to begin with. And also, it does not solve the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse, which is actually something that requires leadership and organizational efforts rather than to put that on the role of minorities in the personnel group. And another thing that is really important here is that it is very much about the values and the morals and the discussions around professionalism that is key. because it turns out that sort of in terms of getting functioning personnel groups, both male and female personnel, and to limit sexual exploitation and abuse, working with both men and women in the personnel on issues of gender equality is the key to overcome many of these problems. So you cannot get around that by just adding women. That problem will not sort itself out. Even a study by Karim and Beardsley show that the situation can actually even get worse in terms of discrimination and harassment if you just add women without, as a leader, also working with the organizational culture. So there's sort of no quick fix in this, also not in terms of the sexual exploitation and abuse. And I think most leaders that I've worked with also know that that is something that is very clearly part of the professional development aspect. So I think we should stop also using those kinds of arguments in the overall policy debates and sort of really try to move towards more effective arguments and targeting. And particularly that also goes with increasing the number of peacekeeping troops, because that really requires also systematic organizational analysis of what the specific problems are in terms of deployment. I would like to give an example here of how research and policy are now starting to come together on this. This is a part of the ELSA initiative, the MOVIP project of measuring opportunities for women in peace operations by DCAF and Cornell University, which try to collect systematic and comparable data, partly so we can have a discussion between different states on how to address this problem. And also that it allows for a systematic and targeted approach by analyzing different organizational problems that can exist to try to identify for each specific organization what is the problem in Norway or the UK or in Canada or in Uruguay, because those can differ between contexts. So how do we actually, in our specific case, get to the point of how we can get or improve women's participation in peacekeeping? So it's really very much about sort of creating this targeted action in the core processes, just like Charlotte was describing, sort of not to put this on the sidelines, but actually get to the core of the problem. And the final statement, this is one I think we're going to discuss more and more, and I think, like Charlotte said, it's actually going to take us very much straight to the core of the security debate again, as we now see that we have a return to national defense in many states with the worsening sort of global security situation. And so now we're starting to see something the feminists have said for a long time: can you practice WPS only externally if you don't also practice it internally? But what does that really then mean? So is WPS also important for national defense, or is it only in peacekeeping? Well, this is actually something I've been thinking about for the last year and a half in a project, and it's interesting because here it also meets the connection, sort of gender equality policies, just like Charlotte was describing in the EU context, also meets WPS, which has very much been sort of developing two different policy spheres by different actors and in different documents and in different thinking. So they don't match. Sweden, for example, was naturally on gender equality and worked internationally on WPS, but those are not in sync at the national level yet. I think they're moving in direction of that, particularly given the feminist foreign policy, but it's not fully sort of integrated in one way yet. It's also an interesting question when we talk about positive participation, one of the pillars of WPS, and inclusion and influence. So if you look at the breakdown statistics on Sweden, it's very obvious that quite a large proportion of women actually don't have a position on many of the core questions regarding national security. So, for example, here I took the one on if it's important to have a strong defense. 20% of the women actually don't have an opinion. In some other areas, it actually close to 50%, where you can suspect that a large proportion of those do actually not have an opinion. If we look at security matters, there's also a difference in resilience and preparedness for crisis and sort of the understanding of what a conflict or attack would mean in Sweden between men and women that is also quite substantial. So I think it would be interesting to have that continuous debate on what do these questions also mean when we think about our own national security contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. It was really a really great comprehensive overview, and you really left us with some really nice thoughts to think about it. And I will now give the floor, last but not least, to our third speaker, Catherine Wright, which is a senior lecturer at Newcastle University. Catherine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this important conference. Eu gostaria de estar em Lisboa com o sol, although my sources on the ground tell me that the sun is actually not out in Lisbon today. That was my very bad attempt at Portuguese. So my intervention is structured around a series of provocations directed at individuals, but also organisations, and draws from my academic research, which is concerned with how institutions engage with WPS. And I focused in particular in my research on NATO and the EU, including my co-authored book published last year, NATO, Gender and the Military, Women Organising from Within. So for transformation, understanding how institutions function and their particular gender regimes, as Professor Carreras pointed out this morning, is key. And there's a huge amount of academic work on this. And along with the Quaker Council for European Affairs, I've been working on a project to produce a best practice guide to translate some of this academic research into tangible advice for those working on gender and inclusivity and peace and security, covering why it matters, what good leadership looks like, and how we can overcome resistance. And we launched that report and accompanying short YouTube videos this Tuesday, the 10th of November. So in order to consider the possibility for transformation, we need to look at co-option or co-optation. So how is it that institutions or organisations come to engage with women, peace and security? So we need to reflect on how co-option occurs. And I think, after all, if we go back to kind of the origins of 1325, wasn't the very aim of feminist activists at the Security Council to get the agenda co-opted by the Security Council and also member states? So we can challenge the how of that co-option in terms of transformation. But if you pursue a Security Council resolution, then co-option, if it's adopted, is going to happen. And that then sets the scope of what is possible. And the other point I want to bring to this kind of discussion of transformation, which I think is linked to that, is actually the significant visibility of WPS in recent years. So this is both a strength, but also, I would argue, a huge weakness of women, peace and security. So we need only look to the plethora of states, militaries, regional organisations and civil society keen to tell us about all the work they're doing on WPS. And I think the 20th anniversary is another good example of the huge visibility of the agenda. There have been many, many virtual events across the globe for the last few weeks. And that's not to say that this isn't all great and it isn't all really, really important, because it is, but it should also give us pause for thought. Okay, and we shouldn't, what the point I'm trying to make is we should be careful to think that this kind of visibility means that the momentum is still present in the same way. And this makes me reflect back to an interview I did at NATO, and this was quite a few years ago now, where a NATO official commented that it can be difficult for NATO member states if they are seen not to be supportive of WPS. And this didn't mean that all member states supported it, it was about perceptions. So in other words, some might oppose WPS, but to make this known would have had kind of political difficulties, would have caused political difficulties for them. So it didn't mean there wasn't any resistance. It just means that in some forms, resistance to transformation is far more subtle and therefore arguably far more of a threat to WPS than the vocal opposition that we can put our finger on. And I think, after all, if we don't know what we're dealing with, how can we seek to challenge such resistance? And resistance to WPS, the antithesis of transformation, in some cases, often seemingly paradoxically, means engaging very, very vocally with WPS, or of using the language of WPS to subvert transformative aspirations. And we only really need to look back to last week and Russia's efforts in the Security Council to weaken and undermine WPS. But we can also look closer to home, okay, and to our own institutions to think what form that might take. So co-option of the gender is its success, but it's also its weakness, and we need to be alert but also reflective, and we can't simply disown parts of the agenda that we disagree with. So to support transformation, those doing work on WPS need to be reflective of their own positions and positionality, and consider kind of what are the intended, but also importantly, unintended consequences of doing WPS work, and who and what are we excluding through particular understandings of an engagement with women, peace and security. So that being said, I think we should not underestimate change from the margins, or kind of the less visible change that happens within institutions. And we shouldn't presume that those working within institutions which require transformation in line with WPS cannot push for change without having this visibility. But we should be wary, and we should be asking kind of what change, who's changed, and why. And I think related to this, we also need to be wary of self-promotion of WPS work by states, institutions, and individuals. We need to consider what work is this doing, and does it reflect the reality of work within that institution? Or is the perception that an institution is doing women, peace and security perversely allowing resistance to more transformative change? So these are kind of the unintended consequences of visibility to WPS work, even if we can also see the benefits to it. And I think also in terms of the self-promotion of WPS work by individuals and organisations, I think Professor Egnell pointed to this, that gender also plays a role in just whose WPS expertise is accepted, and just who is seen as being able to speak on this agenda in perhaps more valid ways. So for me, reflection on behalf of those of us doing WPS work, but also the institutions that are worked for, is key to supporting the transformative potential of women, peace and security. And there's two aspects that I want to pick up on here. So first is that if we're implementing women, peace and security should feel uncomfortable if it is to be transformative. So it should feel uncomfortable for us, and it should feel uncomfortable for the institutions we work for. If it's easy, then it's very much not what we intend. It's not doing what we intend it to do. And in that sense, WPS work is often kind of the most difficult work to do within peace and security. And to ensure WPS work is transformative, then we need to allow space for critical voices to call out blind spots in that WPS work, be they critical voices either inside or outside your institution. And everyone doing WPS work is in some respects in a position of power, but at whatever level you're at, then there's also important to acknowledge that you've benefited from a particular amount of privilege. And I think it takes courage to be able to see where you might benefit from a system which disadvantages others. So doing WPS work, the reflective part is really important. And that doesn't mean, I mean, this is not about us as individuals, rather it's about a system which has been built from a particular worldview, which we know puts women and other minoritized groups at a disadvantage because they weren't at the table when it was conceived of. And this is exactly what WPS is trying to challenge if it is to be transformative. So voices matter, but most important is actually listening to those critical voices and hearing the voices of people that don't look like you, and providing a safe space for them to be able to do so. And also acknowledging the labour and strength that it takes for them to speak truth to power. And then the second point I want to make in respect to this is that for WPS work to be effective, it is necessarily political, because it advocates transformation to make our institutions more inclusive, to put those individuals at the table. And we know that the political is not only personal, but also ultimately international. And there's a very real personal toll to doing gender work within institutions. It is draining, it is tiring, and often it makes those doing it very angry because change can seem so slow. And the other thing that we know about institutions is that, and to quote Sarah Ahmed here, when you raise a problem, which transformative WPS work does, then you become the problem for the institution to manage. And that's going to take a huge toll on you. And this is because you're pushing for change against a structure which is built to reproduce itself. So you're kind of swimming upstream, for want of a better metaphor. So to counter this and to keep your sanity in many respects, you're going to need allies. And these supporters and friends can be within your own organisation, but sometimes they're going to be outside of it. And they'll be able to shine a light on what is happening and act as a sounding board for you. So I think the thing to stress is that progress can and is being made on the WPS agenda. And yes, sometimes we do go backwards because that's what happens when you work towards transformation. But it's also important that we do not get tired or fatigued because actually there's too much at stake. This is too important a piece of work. And if we look at what's happening in the world at the moment, then we can see that this work could not matter more than it does at this current juncture in time. So to conclude, the transformative potential of WPS has very much not been lost, in my view. Rather, it's down to us on an individual level and also on behalf of the organisations that you work for to constantly kind of be re-evaluating and reflecting on the WPS work that is being done by you and others, but also reflecting on the unintended consequences of that WPS work, bringing in those critical voices to check that what you're doing is setting you and the institution on the right path. And if we're to realise a very different world, 20 years from now, maybe we could be optimistic and say 10, we need to challenge ourselves to live up to these aspirations. And being seen to be doing WPS work is never going to be enough. What we need to do is do that work, and that work is always better, I would argue, when we do it together. And that's me done.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It was really great presentation. It was really funny, actually, when you said that you become, so those practitioners and those working on WPS and security, when they find themselves saying or acknowledging that they are the problem, because that's what I feel almost every day. Thank you for that. So thank you all the three speakers. We already have some questions. I will present the questions, and then I will give all the three speakers to address it. So, first question: How do you think we should train leaders to be gender responsive? This is really interesting. And what kind of approach would work better? So the second question, it's related to Louise's presentation, that she demonstrated the importance of the research evidence to accurately assess reality and how it contradicts some common assumption of women, peace and security. Would you say, here comes the question, would you say that women, peace and security relies on misleading assumptions? What are the implications of this strategy regarding its implementation? And the third question, and I honestly also believe that, and agree with what was said, that the Women PS implementation has to come from the inside, internally. So change has to come from within, and we have to tackle these obstacles from the inside. So what I like to ask you, how can we overcome these obstacles? Some things you already mentioned, but I would like to explore this a little bit more, further. So maybe we can start in the order of the speaking. So Charlotte, I give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So on obstacles, a long time ago, I worked with a very senior police officer in Sweden. It was in the early years when I started this work, which was, by the way, much more difficult than it is now. And he said that to work with these topics in an organization, you have to come with certain sort of personal traits or skills. And one is that you cannot be a person who is easily offended. You cannot be a person that is, you know, in a big need of confirmation and recognition from others. And you also have to be able to be very, very happy for very, very small steps. And I think actually that's quite true. At the same time, of course, it's very sad. But obstacles, I think, to me, obstacles are part of the job. And I think it's not necessarily a bad part of the job, because if you deal with obstacles, both in terms of your own self-esteem and you know how you see upon yourself, it feels good, you know, you can feel stronger and you can build on that. But also in the perception of others, there is quite a lot of research saying that, you know, it's you know, if you deal with obstacles in a smart and good way and you get out on the other side, it can actually really strengthen your platform. So obstacles is, as most things, is very much what you do with it. I think it is a part of the job. I think that if you do work with this topic, you have to expect obstacles, so you cannot be surprised. And if it becomes too personally difficult, you know, perhaps you need to take a break or something like that. But I have been working now for many years with this topic, and so my strategy is to have a very solid and good network of people who I can speak with 24/7, and also people who I know do not only say things that I might want to hear myself, you know. So you have an honest and open relation, and you can actually draw on that. I think that is very, very important. I think that is also but that is important, you know, in any professional capacity you might have. So this is not unique, but it is very helpful. Of course, I think also it is important to try to look at it from, you know, your, whatever word I should use, you know, your enemy or your oppressor, or, you know, that idiot over there who say those things that you don't agree with, you know, but to try to see things from their perspective, because of course, it is not like that every gender advisor or any feminist researcher or any, you know, gender, women, peace and security person is like, you know, to know, you know, not better than everyone else, or know it, you know. So of course you also have to be very reflexive and reflect upon, you know, yourself, etc., and also to listen and to have a dialogue, you know, and to try to be constructive. And of course there are resistance and resistance. So I think when you did it for a while, I think you will learn to know the difference, but a little bit too many times in the gender community of practice with people I meet, I feel that people have this instinct reaction that everyone who is saying anything against, you know, my research or what we do or what we stand for is, you know, bottom line is an idiot. And I think that is not really true. So I think what I said before on that, there is so much work to be done within the community on having these discussions, on self-reflection, and that goes for all of us, including the group which I think has been flying too much under the radar until now, and that is the researchers themselves. So, you know, there is a lot of looking at what others are doing, but not so much looking into the community of practice and the practitioners and the practices of research on this topic. So I think we have a lot of things to do. On gender responsive leaders, perhaps Louise can say something about the gender coach program, because I think her experiences are much more up to date than mine. But I think that is a brilliant approach. I think to change from the inside is very important. We also, I talked to you about before, you know, that we have those preconditions for success, which has to be in place: gender mainstreaming, gender responsive leadership, and another is in-house capacity, because in-house capacity outranks every day of the week external capacity, like whatever you will call it, like help desks or platforms or consultants, etc. So we see that a lot. So that is important, but at the same time, it's also important that in-house capacity and doing it from the inside is, of course, not everything. You also need very strong actors outside. And I would like to raise one thing I raised also in the seminar last week, I think, that, you know, it's really important to have actors outside the institutions who dare to speak truth to the power and that are not so too, you know, attracted by the siren song of the policy circles so that they want to be close. Because, you know, we in institutions and organizations, we also need to be meeting someone who can speak truth. And I said last week that we meet civil society organizations a lot. That's a big part of our work. Even if I think really hard, I cannot remember that we have been criticized or that people have been claiming that we are doing things wrong or that, you know, whatever. And I guess that we are not that perfect. But of course, then we have this relational challenge where also civil society colleagues, but also many researchers actually are getting funds from the organization. So, you know, where do you get your money? Who is paying you? And I think this is also an important discussion to have in the community. The final, I want to say related to that, also relate what Catherine say about co-optation. Yeah, but I think when you speak about co-optation and also in relation to the UN Security Council, it's also important to speak about complicity by, you know, the people who, you know, are not necessarily co-opted, but there is a relation also on complicity, I think, and that is, I think that is important on the equation. I said before, again, I say it again, I don't think that Russia is our biggest problem, or those other countries, you know, no matter what happened last week. And of course, I dislike that as much as you do. But that is not our biggest challenge. Our biggest challenge is to be found by friendly countries who project themselves doing more and better than they are actually doing. And that is also how we lose momentum, etc. And finally, my final thing I have to say is that it was said many times that, you know, yeah, but we shouldn't have to justify, and, you know, why do we have to answer why all, you know, after 20 years, etc. But this is also, as with this, you know, co-optation / complicity relation, it's actually, that's also a relation between the ones requesting that, you know, why to be answered, and the others, perhaps us, who are then giving them what they are asking for. Because of course, there you have a choice. You don't have to spend your time finding those evidence if you think that, you know, it's good enough that the council already decided that we should do this. So, you know, why should we even, you know, spend limited time on that? So I think
society, we remain very much committed to the democratic principle of equality and underpins this agenda, actually. More specifically, today, and from an operational point of view, the improvements that the inclusion of women at all levels can bring are becoming evident, and became actually with this action. More efficient and effective military operations is a valuable goal and is achieving more sustainable peace processes. Having women included in the decision-making process at all levels will ensure that society's different needs and concerns will better integrated in our responses. Allow me to highlight some of the achievements Portugal has accomplished since the adoption in 2009 of the first National Action Plan on the implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, as well as the ongoing initiatives to deepen our engagement with this agenda. Starting with the achievements, I would like to acknowledge the important work carried out by our armed forces in setting the scene for women and women's participation in our forces deployed abroad in the framework of our multilateral commitments. And to prove how this commitment has been taken seriously, data from last August indicates that regarding Portugal's participation in United Nations peacekeeping missions, women represented over 18% of individual military officers and 6.6% of formed contingents, numbers above the targets set in United Nations uniform gender strategies. But of course, this is not all about numbers. When we take a closer look at the functions that women perform in these missions, the picture shows that due to several factors, including the fact that women have only joined the armed force in 1988, despite some operational activities, their main roles still fall into the category of either combat support or combat service support. We also have realized that we are amongst the NATO member states which have more women applying for military service, but this ratio is drastically reduced when we analyze the number of women recruited. These findings underline the urgency of understanding the reasons behind these high attrition rates in order to design policy in an effective and coherent way. That is why I have asked for a study addressing this question in order to have a proposal until the end of this year of an in-depth research project focused on the recruitment processes in our armed forces. Beyond what the armed forces have achieved, the government has also been actively developing the necessary institutions to support this change. National Defense is working closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the Secretary of State for Citizenship and Equality to ensure that gender equality is fully integrated into our actions. One of the first steps taken in 2008, ahead of many of our peers, was to ban all restrictions on women serving in all positions. I would highlight 3 specific steps taken recently as an illustration of our commitment to this goal. The first was the adoption of the National Defense Action Plan for implementing the National Strategy of Equality, including the National Action Plan of Women, Peace and Security. Its many indicators have formed the basis of our common action and the measure of our commitments. In this sectorial action plan, a second measure was included, leading to the establishment of an Office for Equality under the direct authority of the Ministry of National Defense, as the mechanism to assist national defense institutions in the implementation of the action plan, which is currently headed by Lieutenant Colonel Diana Moraes. The third aspect relates to the decision by the Portuguese government to have a member from the National Defense as national representative at the European Union Task Force on Human, Peace and Security, which has been in place since the beginning of this year. Together with the chairing of the NATO Committee on Gender's Perspective, these measures provide Portugal with the necessary knowledge and best practices, allowing us to apply them and adjust by incorporating lessons learned. Portugal has been at the forefront when it comes to gender equality and to the implementation of women, peace and security agenda. We are proud to be a part of this community of interests and are profoundly engaged with it. Looking ahead, I would say that two main challenges remain in the medium term and one challenge in the long run, to which Minister Cravinho alluded this morning. The long-term challenges regards the necessary consensus within societies and within the international community on the importance of looking at the contributions and roles of women in peace and security as being essential and requiring adaptations to our way of doing business. This is something we need to continue to work for, talking to the broader society, interacting with both men and women, in order to understand the concerns that may develop on this matter. We know this agenda is relevant. We need to make sure that the majority of those around us understands that too. Responding to that, we have set cooperation with civil society as a priority of this mandate, and despite the limitations imposed by the pandemic, we are doing all efforts to reach out through digital platforms, as this seminar shows, as well as we will be doing by the end of the month with the second National Defense Seminar. We have also recently added to Project Engineers for One Day, targeting girls of school age, so that they might experience what a military engineer professional looks like. Similar initiatives are being developed. The two short-term challenges relate, on one hand, to assuring that women have a meaningful participation at all levels. This requires better knowledge of what is currently happening and the good practices that we should keep and share across the institution. It also requires creating the formal opportunities for women to be engaged, respecting hierarchies, but making sure their contributions are incorporated when it is evident that they may bring relevant insights to our missions. On the other hand, we need to continue investing in education and training. Transformation cannot be achieved without major investments in education. Mainstreaming gender is a priority of our action plan, and education and training are the sustainable way to achieve it. Considering this, we have incorporated two models, one for gender equality and another regarding women, peace and security agenda, into all basic training and promotion courses at all levels and all branches of the armed forces. There is still progress to be made here, and the best models need to be considered to make this investment a truly transformative process, fully linked to the strategic, operational and technical needs of the defense. There are many other aspects that have been addressed here today, evidencing the wealth of perspectives and options available. I am sure the national community dealing with women, peace and security agenda has come out of this day stronger, further inspired, and better connected to their counterparts elsewhere. I urge all of you to continue this path of dialogue and to look at the Portuguese Ministry of Defense as a committed partner, always open for dialogue. Thank you very much for your work on this conference today. Thank you.
Well, we get to the end of this interesting day. And as far as I've seen in the comments, it's been a very exciting day for all the participants. So, on behalf of Director of the National Defense Institute and of the head of the Office for Equality of the Ministry of Defense, I thank you all for your presence, and I declare this conference closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank
Thank
you,
you all.
Secretary of State. Thank you for your words.
Thank you.